Hey guys, I'm Dave.
And I'm Len.
Welcome to Wargame Chat. Today we're going to talk about not the best tanks of World War II, but our favorite tanks of World War II. The reason we're doing favorite as opposed to best is because if we say what we think are the best, someone's going to disagree and be upset about it, so we don't want anyone to be upset, so we're just going to talk about our favorite tanks. My first one, I would say, believe it or not, the Czech 38T series. I mean, they made all those Stugs and stuff out of them later on and stuff. Even though it wasn't the best tank of theirs, it was a very successful series, and it was relatively reliable and stuff. I mean, the original version as it was with a 37.5 millimeter gun wasn't particularly useful against like T-34 tanks and stuff, but later versions where they made not a Stug, I mean they made Martyrs out of them, not Stugs, but the Martyr versions, yeah, those could take on T-34s no problem. What's your first tank that's your favorite?
I was thinking the Sherman tank, because, well, it's fast, long range, dependable, easy to repair, easy to maintain.
Motorized turret, so you're not sitting there turning a wheel to try and turn the turret.
Yeah, because I think a lot of people,
The only problem with it was the fuel it used. It used gas, so they called them Ronsons. They would light up pretty easy if they were hit. But I think the British version used diesel, and that's
I try to remember the early versions had a failed aviation motor, so it had to use aviation gas. But at a certain point, they switched over to a different motor, a different diesel motor. And one thing also is noted, they had good ammunition storage. They, as a result, well, you know, the early versions would burn up. The ammunition and go up. Shermans were not known for their turrets flying through the air like certain countries we won't talk about. Okay.
Another one, I would say the most feared tank I know of would not be the T-34, it would be the KV-1. A lot of things attributed to the T-34 actually occurred with the KV-1, like when the Germans were first doing their invasion of Russia. Those tanks that were holding them up in places at first were actually KV-1s, not T-34s. They didn't encounter those until later. They had a lot of trouble penetrating the armor on the KV-1s, and I mean they had instances where one KV-1 was holding up like a large number of tanks and stuff. So,
well, yeah, I was about to say, when you're under fire, you're not taking good. It's an enemy tank, and they're shooting at us, and their bullets bounce off.
And I mean, originally the KV-1 had a 76 millimeter gun, I think it was, and I mean that could take on all the German armor at that time. And then later on, when German armor became better, then they put an 85 millimeter gun on it, which was an effective gun too. So yeah, that whole series was effective.
I remember this old cartoon. How, you know, real soldiers, Kraut tank coming down the road, and a Wargamer, it's a Panther 4F with side panels and things like with a 75 millimeter cannon. You know, actually, I have a thing. Special love for things like assault guns and tank destroyers. I mean, tank destroyers, that sounds so mean, even though the armor is thinner.
Yeah, but tank destroyers generally had a large gun on them, though, so I mean, I guess you would call them glass cannons. I mean, they could do a lot of damage, but they couldn't take hits.
Because, what is it, the German and the Russian there were assault guns, which are infantry support, and Jag Panthers, which were tank hunters. And they were meant to be like the main line of resistance, hence they up-armored them. With the Americans, we thought in terms of we need a fast vehicle to stop the, get there in time to stop the breakthrough, or at least, trick the enemy. So when the enemy hits the main line of resistance, there's a lot fewer of them, and the infantry won't panic as much or something.
Another one, let's see here. Maybe, well, the Panther tank, I mean, was a good tank. They never made enough of them, but it was a good tank. what would be one of your next ones that you liked?
Well, actually, a sentimental one is the M3 and the M5 Stuart. Of course, that's because I read the Haunted Tank comic books when I was young.
Well, there was an instance where some Tiger tanks were parked, and some stewards got behind them and took out the Tiger tanks. Mind you, there was no crew in the Tigers at the time and stuff, but I mean, they still took them out, though.
Well, I think there was one where an M8 armored car, you happen to notice that the Tiger tank was in a narrow lane with the walls or something, trees. So they were right behind them. So they shot in as fast as they could every round they could into the Tiger tank.
Yeah. Well, most people don't realize this. Main battle tanks are, well, the World War II tanks weren't main battle tanks, but tanks in general, the rear armor is really thin. And I mean, like an M1 Abrams, they had one where the engine was taken out in the Second Gulf War by I think it was a Russian 25 millimeter round or something. So I mean, even on modern main battle tanks, the rear armor is extremely thin. There were some exceptions to that, though, like the KV-1, though its thinnest armor was in the rear, it was substantially more armor in the rear than a lot of the other tanks. And the T-34, too, it was thinner in the rear, but still substantially more armor than most other tanks in the rear.
Yeah. You know, we haven't mentioned any British tanks.
None of them were that good in tank-to-tank combat. I mean, they were good as like infantry supports, but they weren't all that effective at tanking out tanks. That's probably why.
Yeah, because I was about to say, with the British, except for like a few months during the war, they were always inferior to the enemy. And you had to have a lot of courage to be a British tanker. You know your stuff was not as good as the enemy. So the only time they had like superiority was like in Burma, where the Japanese tanks were. Well, the thing with the Japanese tanks is they're designed to provide mobile fire support for the infantry in the jungle, and they did that part well.
Yeah.
But the problem is that practically every every tank they encountered was better than theirs.
Yeah, the Japanese tanks weren't really meant for tank-to-tank combat. Like you said, they were just there for infantry support, which they were able to do effectively. Yeah. Just like the Sherman, with all the bad things people say about it, did do infantry support well.
Yeah, because actually that's there's a Sherman Firefly with they put in a...
Yeah, I think that was a British tank. They put on a huge gun on it, and that was a real tank killer.
Yeah, that the Colonel Legend, that had no problems of bumping off the Tiger.
Yeah, it could penetrate the front armor on a Tiger.
There was something about they couldn't produce it fast enough, so they ended up each company would just have one platoon of Fireflies.
Right. Yeah.
And the thing is, they also had a problem. The gun was real long, so in confined places like forests and urban areas, which Western Europe had a lot of, they were at a handicap. That's why they always have them teamed up with other Shermans. Plus, also there's something about their heavy explosive round wasn't as good as the regular Shermans. So.
Yeah, that was meant to be just a tank killer, though, so I'm not surprised that its HE round wasn't as good as the regular Sherman.
Yeah. So.
What else can I think of here? I like some of those specialty armored vehicles. This one I hesitate to call it a tank. The Germans had it. It was the Brumbar with that really short but fat gun on the front, which was that was just like total infantry support and for destroying like fortifications. That wouldn't be used as like an anti-tank weapon whatsoever. But it had really thick armor on it and stuff. So for a specialty tank, it was kind of interesting.
Well, I was thinking the Germans never did build their mouse tank.
Well, did you see the blueprints and stuff for that? They've printed. It's like, my God, the thing was like almost like a battleship with the amount of armor it had on it.
Somebody said that it was meant to be a mobile pillbox. Yeah. You just drive it slowly to someplace, park it, and then...
Yeah. The problem is, I mean, your enemy, though, has air support generally, so even if the thing is a mobile pillbox, still dropping a 250-pound bomb on the top of the turret's going to destroy it, no matter how thick the armor is.
The French, actually, they had pretty decent tanks. In fact, when the Germans invaded Russia, one Panzer division consisted of nothing but French tanks. So,
Speaking of that, the Germans had some of those, those French tanks. I can't remember what they did. They used some of them actually directly, I think, as they were on the East Front. Like that was called a Sumo or something like that, French Sumo tank, and there was the other one, Char 1B or something like that.
There was, I think, a Renault or something.
But I think on the East Front they just used those as is, and I mean, I'm sure they were useful.
Yeah, because I think the Char B, that was their heavy tank with two big guns. You know, they had a heavy anti-tank gun, I think like a 37 millimeter, which was big for, and a 75 millimeter gun on the side.
Yeah, that was meant like a World War I tank for like destroying fortifications and infantry and stuff. That wasn't really meant for anti-tank, but yeah, I mean, on the East Front, when they used them, like I said, I'm sure they did well as infantry support, probably not so well as for anti-tank duties, but they weren't meant for that.
And I'm trying to remember, there's this real big French tank. I think they made about 4 or 5 of them. And they were so big, they each gave... they named each tank, I think after a French province, like the Lorraine and the Charlemagne. They had a crew of 12, and I think they had a couple of them operational in May 1940. But the problem was they couldn't get the rail cars to take them to the front. And I think when the French surrendered, they destroyed all their copies. One survived because either they forgot to destroy it or they did a bad job of it. So the Germans put it in a museum, but it was like, there's pictures of it like knocking down walls, pushing trees over, and it was like, yeah, you didn't want to be in front of it, but it was like, the super tank, it would have been the super tank of World War I. So, this is our war nerd chat. Your favorite tank?
And one tank, I wouldn't call this one of my favorite tanks, but that's worth mentioning because it's not mentioned very often, would be the Hetzer, which I think used a Czech 38T chassis instead of just making a standard Martyr out of it. They made more of a, I guess you would call it not a tank, what would you call that? More of a... traditional tank destroyer on, and I think the gun on it even had a little bit of movement left and right, so you didn't have to turn the tank to aim the gun in azimuth and stuff. But I don't know if it was a good tank or not. There's not really much said about it. So
actually, I thought it was an infantry support tank.
Well, the gun on it was certainly strong enough to take on U.S. and British tanks.
Yeah, because I was about to say there was a debate before the war, a doctrine debate over whether tanks should be like in their own armored divisions and doing blitzkrieg tactics, but they also have to be realistic. Tanks are very good for infantry morale. You want the infantry to go forward, put a tank on. They'll go if they get to follow behind a tank, and they'll stay in their place if there's a tank defending them. So they had to. Try to build, what they tried to compromise is build enough tanks to fulfill both roles. And things like the Heinzer was a good infantry support tank. And also, for every 3 regular tanks, you could build 4 assault guns. And sometimes those extra barrels make the difference between victory or defeat.
I saw some experimental thing at the end of World War II. It certainly wasn't a tank or an assault gun. It was basically just 4 wheels and a platform that they put, I think it was a Pac 40 on. It was like a motorized Pac 40. But... All right, any other tanks you can think of?
That's it.
All right, that's all we got for this time, guys. Have a good one.
All right.